As the podcasting industry continues to grow, the big elephant in the room is gender and race. Like in other forms of media, podcast hosts and creators, especially those that are successful, tend to be overwhelmingly male and white. Part of what Immigrantly seeks to do is disrupt that paradigm and bring forward voices that naturally add more color to stories we hear every day. But before we came around, others were already doing this. Yes, today I am excited to talk to Ahmed Ali Akbar, a writer, journalist, and the host of See Something, Say Something, an incredible podcast where Ahmed talks to Muslims from all across different industries and talks about culture, current events, and being Muslim in America.
They were like, hey, you've done some stuff on immigrant identity, on Muslim identity. What would be your ideal podcast? And I came to them with this idea that we would do a podcast that sort of featured the widest view of Muslims possible. And I had a team, all of people who are non-Muslim and non-Desi, all wonderful white women who I love. And I just met with some of them last night. We're still close.
Ahmed talks about the things that American Muslims are talking about right now, which can range from mass incarceration to memes. Ahmed's work has been an inspiration to me as I have been finding my voice on Immigrantly, and I am so excited to have him on the show. Welcome, Ahmed. So good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with your podcast,
Sure.
See Something, Say Something. I'm a big fan, and you have covered so many topics from jinns to hip-hop and Islam and proms, right? This was part of BuzzFeed, but you've moved away from it. Now
That's
you're
right.
doing it solo, pretty much like me. I'm doing it solo too.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges?
So when I started podcasting and I would compare myself to my friends, I totally felt like I had a huge amount of privilege because I got developed, basically. I was very lucky that I was lucky that I ended up at BuzzFeed out of a grad school with very little journalism experience, and I got trained on the job for 2 years, and I did all that stuff, like all that stuff that you're mentioning had its roots in like me writing online, right? And then they developed me in a way which they were like, hey, you've done some stuff on immigrant identity, on Muslim identity. What would be your ideal podcast? And I came to them with this idea that we would do a podcast that sort of featured the widest view of Muslims possible. And I had a team, all of people who are non-Muslim and non-Desi, all wonderful white women who I love. And I just met with some of them last night. We're still close. And they helped me develop it. And I learned to produce as well. It's such that when I left, I already knew how to make a show. I didn't know how to make a show like 2 years ago. But when I went independent after they closed down the audio department and they gave me the rights to the show, it wasn't actually that hard. It's obviously not as easy as having like 5 people giving you ideas, but I know how to like craft a story and an interview now, and I learned on the job.
Yeah, this is so interesting because for me, this is like on-job training. I'm a human rights activist.
Yeah.
I have no background in production, and I do this solo. So when it's sometimes, it's like when you say ignorance is bliss. In my case, it is because I think I know. I don't know if I know,
Right.
but you know how it is.
I'm sure
it's like,
you know.
Yeah, but
You
still,
know.
it's like, you're like, oh my God, because when I hear other podcasters talk about their team and stuff, and then you're like, I hope whatever I am doing is right.
Well, I mean, just pretend like you got a team if you don't have a team. That's what I do now. I'm like, yeah, my team. It's like me and a friend of mine now from Michigan. We just call and talk about the show. But
Why did the
Yeah.
podcast move away from
Well, they
BuzzFeed?
closed their audio department. So
Oh.
they had a lot of restructuring in the last year, and they laid off all those people that I was working with. I was there for a couple months more, but they were like, we're not doing podcasts anymore. So either, and my contract was up at the end of the year. So it was either like find something else to do or, like let your contract lapse basically. And that's what we ended up doing is, I finished out my contract and I was like, well, if they give me the rights to it, I'll do it independently. And there was just no room to make it there anymore because they had pivoted away from a podcast, which is a very common thing in digital media. I learned over the last 4 years. So I wanted to make it, I wanted to keep making it, and I wanted it to, I thought it was an opportunity for growth because it didn't, like at BuzzFeed, it was really great because it felt like I kept I kept kind of being nurtured, and I was
Yeah.
lucky in that way. Like, it was a huge privilege. Like, I saw a lot of my talented friends not get nurtured at times, which was really frustrating. They left and thrived afterwards, whereas like I got nurtured really into like doing like I kept doing things that I wanted to do there until
But
I didn't anymore.
but do you think freelancing gives you more room for experimentation because it's like you're the
Right.
producer, you're the host, you decide everything basically. I mean, there's a downside to that,
If I'm
but
being honest, what gives you room for experimentation in all my experience in media is money. Money
yeah,
gives you the time to experiment, and that's the terrible answer, but it's the truth. It's like
that's a fair
a
point.
budget, time, all that stuff comes up, and it's like what I think it's correct that you should not let that ever stop you, and you should be creative in your limits, and you should just start making stuff. Which is, I admire that about you, that you have like a real ass job and you're like also doing this other thing. Like a lot of people like want to message me and be like, oh, how do I make a podcast? Well, just start recording at first and listen to it. It'll be terrible, and then you do it again and you'll get better and you'll get better. Like I can't listen to the first couple episodes. I would say like I've generally always been pretty good at like interviewing people and talking to people, but I still can't listen to the first few episodes of the podcast because it's different, like
Nobody can, especially listening to your own voice.
I don't mind.
Oh,
I hate to say it, but I don't mind listening to my own voice. I'm
nice.
not like I like the sound of my own voice, but somehow I got over it. I don't know why. Like it's fine.
Talking about money, I saw like I was doing research on you and I saw like you have a Patreon account for your podcast. Now, being a Desi and being from Pakistan, I can say this for myself. I just cannot ask people
Absolutely.
to give money. It is so tabooed in Pakistani culture.
Right.
It's like, especially if you ask Desis, like your friends and family, they're like, what's wrong with you?
Right.
Have you felt that? Like, especially when you ask for people to contribute to your Patreon?
Right. Well, it took first of all, like I stopped making the show in October of 2018, and then I didn't start again until May because I was giving myself permission to do that. A lot of people were messaging me that like, what do you need to get this done? Like, we will give you money to make it. I got a lot of messages saying that. So it wasn't like I was like it was my first thought. It was like an idea that I was like, well, I know Patreon is a thing that works and that people have used it. And I just, I waited and I took my options from other places. And this like creativity and independence thing that you're mentioning, it's like I would talk to podcast networks and they'd be like, yeah, like we have like mostly white people. So I think like adding your podcast would be really good. They didn't have any idea what my podcast was about or why it matters to people. So I was like, I don't really want to tie myself to another horse and I don't know where it's going, like I know where I'm going. So I would rather just set it up for myself. And yeah, it feels a little bit, I would say maybe I don't have that as much because it might be my own family culture. I mean, my family gives and promotes and supports, and nobody has ever said anything like that, like shaming about it to me, which I'm very lucky that I don't get shamed very much. I know that's like can be a common thing in some Desi families, but a part of why I do the show is because I think it's like, yeah, there's like more, there's a lot of nuance in our own lived experiences, and that's mine, which is like I get a lot of support, I think. So.
Let's talk about your family. So your parents are doctors, both of them, and you grew up where? In Michigan.
Yes.
And you're not a doctor
Nope.
by profession. You wanted to do something in the real world. That's how you put it. Isn't like medicine part of the real world? I was like, I'll ask him this.
Did I say that?
Yeah,
you
did.
That might have been a bit of a mistake just a mistake, I guess. So I think maybe I was contrasting more with my doing a PhD, which is like I think a lot of Desi families, including my own family, and I still feel this pressure now, is like you're not doing anything if you don't have a degree, kind of thing. Like like it's not. Without that, it's nothing. You know what I mean? And I got a master's, and I got it in a thing that was niche and weird, like Islamic studies. I mean, people still liked it because I was doing grad school, but like they don't necessarily see it as a career. And I think I was comparing, like, for instance, getting a PhD in that case versus interacting with like people online. Like I interact with a lot of really interesting people because of the nature of my work in a way that I would be more siloed off.
Are you planning to do PhD?
No.
No.
Not at the moment, but I depends on this how this digital media thing goes. If there's still work around for me in my little niche little corner of the internet. My sisters are both, by the way, civil rights lawyers.
Ah.
So older sisters. So I was like, they covered that.
In Pakistani culture, and again, I'm being very stereotypical right now, but I remember my father wanted me to be a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
I was not interested. He wanted my brother to be an engineer, which he did engineering because my father wanted him to do that. My sister tried medicine. She couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So my father was very disappointed. But then I ended up doing like math, stats, and economics. And my father thought that was all like except for math part, he thought it was humanities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He still treats
Interesting.
economics as humanities.
Yeah, yeah.
Like if I talk to him about my kids and I was telling him that my daughter wants to do at some point economics, like she'll do her bachelor's in economics when she goes to college. And he's like, yeah, but that's humanities. And that's why would she go, like why would she move away from engineering and medicine? And that's how careers are perceived. They have to be marketable.
Right. Well, let me also complicate your picture of my parents, because I think what's important to notice is that they were activists in college, both of them. That's how they met, and that's how they fell in love and had like a love marriage and all that stuff. You know, my mom was like a pseudo communist, maybe. I don't know. Obviously, that didn't last, but because she went to America and chased the American dream, and then they continued to be activists in America. So I grew up with watching my mom make outreach to, you know, the local Black American community, Muslim community in our mosque, do interfaith events with like racist white people, go to the Hill. She, you know, did advocacy for Pakistanis, Muslims. She was involved in ISNA. She had her hand in everything in a way, and mostly my mom. My dad was also very involved and had easier access because he was a man, but my mother was really like my late mother was like kind of the brains behind the operation. And she would work like a 9 to 5 at her office, and then she would stay until 11 p.m. at work, like editing journals for UPNA, which is like a Pakistani doctor association, which to me doesn't, like, I don't understand why that was her thing, but like clearly she wanted to be a journalist growing up, and her father didn't let her, so it was obvious that was her passion. And my father too is like good at his job, but he's a very good doctor, but like an actually really, really good doctor, it seems like. But he is also very, very socially engaged, and that's clearly where his interest is. So I was in a house where that was like their selling point was it'll keep you stable. I thankfully grew up in a stable situation, so like this is the privilege of like growing up as like a child of doctors, where I was like, I just didn't understand the appeal of that. I was like, what's clearly so exciting to you guys is your work outside of your job. So, and you're very good at it. So like maybe because there's more space for brown people now, maybe I can make it my job. And I did. So it's like I see it as continuing their legacy in a way. And so obviously my sisters do as well, because that's why they do civil rights law. It's not because that's why they didn't end up being a doctor. The pressure was higher for them because they were older. But like ultimately I think we all see ourselves as doing what our parents wanted us to do, even if they didn't see it as what we should do.
That's true.
My dad will still be like, anyone who can be a doctor is like, should be a doctor. If you're qualified, like, you should do it, which I think is a ridiculous statement coming from him, knowing who he is. But like, they would be like, be a doctor and then do this stuff on the side.
You know, we all tell our kids
This
that.
is what you're
and
doing.
It's so interesting because I tell my kids this all the time. More than, I think my husband does it more. So he thinks that our kids should take up professions that are marketable and lucrative. And I think it comes down to immigrant mentality.
Yeah.
Because you're not in your culture anymore. You've adopted another culture and you're part of a different community and you want to be financially secure. So that's, I think, more to do with immigrants.
I'm not saying there's not any truth to it. I just think it's more, there's levels to it as well. It's different depending on the person. And as I'm getting in my 30s, I'm starting to understand that pressure a little bit more than I used to, where I was like, yeah, it'll figure itself out. And it is in a way, like I never, I kept moving, you know what I mean? Like I never felt like if I'm not growing, then that's when I'm struggling. And I kept growing through the thing, and I kept getting better gigs. And like people would there would be moments of understanding where my family would be like, "Oh, that's why you're doing that thing." Like I have a plan. Like I know what I'm doing. Like I'm not, and I'm confident enough. I was also given that confidence from them that like I can make an impact, because they made an impact. I saw them tangibly make an impact in people's lives, both as doctors but also as activists. So like, as long as I'm doing that, like, I'm happy, and my wife is going to medical. Oh, by the way, I'll say this also. When I say the real world, I just think like medical school is horrible. I watch a lot of my cousins go
Yeah.
through it.
You end up with a great degree, but then you have to spend like 8 years, right?
You gotta waste some of the best times of your life away from your family. It's like the least immigrant thing ever. It's like, oh, like, why don't you just not be there for your family for the next 5-6 years, because if you don't, you'll fail and it'll all have been worth nothing. Like, I've seen this with every single one of my cousins, and I'm like, I don't want that in my life. I want to be with my family. Like, they're like help nourish me and like make my life move forward.
So, as a kid of immigrants, what were some of the stereotypical things that your family or you did growing up, or your family did that really annoyed you?
Well, I don't know that I can't remember how I definitely unlearned a lot of any self-hatred that I had or whatever. I was definitely like, I wouldn't say this is about stereotypes, but I didn't like eating our food very much growing up into my teens. And
Does it change? I'm hoping it will change
oh
later.
yeah, I mean, I used to get like, my mom used to just be like, she used to make fun of me. She'd be like, I'm from a small town called Saginaw, Michigan. She's like, you were born in Saginaw, Michigan. You're gonna live in Saginaw, Michigan for the rest of your life. You're going to marry a girl from Saginaw. You're never going to speak Urdu again. I was like, Jesus, Mom, you're really putting a complex on me. And she did, such that I learned Urdu. I
You
didn't know
did?
Urdu growing up, and I can speak it now because I took it in college, and I went to India for a couple months. And like, everyone now, like, my name is Rad Brown Dads on Twitter. Everyone thinks of me as like a brown uncle. Like, this transformation from like whitewashed brown teenager to like brown uncle is like, I don't think enough people in my life talk about it. Like, it's really strange to me. But yeah, I still feel like there's the shame that I got was never. I always looked at my parents and was very proud of them. They gave me a lot of because they had a strong narrative of pride in themselves. However, I didn't like when that image would come in conflict with the way kids at school would perceive of them. Like, the idea that like we smelled bad is still something that sticks with me. Like, I shower every day, and my mother was like always into like cleanliness regardless of anything, but I'm always like, I'm never gonna let anyone think that like I smell bad or something like that, like we smell like our food or whatever, or like that. I don't like perceive my parents as having an accent either, for instance. And everyone be like, they're so hard to understand. I'm like, their English is better than yours, okay? Like, my mother's English was very good. She could read like a book in a night, basically. So, like, it was mostly about chafing up against how the rest of the society perceived them and me, than me feeling shame around them, I guess.
And I think it comes down to being different. It's more to do with that, and that creates a threatening environment. So even when people look at me, and when my kids talk about my accent, and they'll say, "Oh, you have such a heavy accent," and I'll be like, "No, I don't think I have like bad accent, if there is a word like bad accent or whatever." And
Well, they're like evaluating your access on a
they are
hierarchy.
exactly, there is a hierarchy of accents
Yeah,
in the
you
US.
have a very like classy, nice accent, but it just in the US
for
it doesn't
them,
sound.
it's like, and growing up in Pakistan, we used to call your accent American
Yeah, yeah, of
accent.
course,
It was
right.
like, this person has American accent.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's interesting how my kids perceive it. But I have spoken to so many young Muslim Americans like yourself, and every time I talk to them, I'm like, I'm hopeful my kids will outgrow a lot of things that they think right now.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the hope. What kind of relationship did you have with your religion?
Oh, well, so I think for me, like, I think there's some negatives to this as well, but I think, like, yeah, Pakistani and Muslim are very intertied with each other, and that can be very exclusionary, obviously. But in our community, it was very community building, in the sense that like it connected me to a lot of other folks, like Arabs, like Black converts, like Indians, Bengalis, all this stuff. We went to the mosque. My mom was like. My mom and dad were both on the board at the mosque. My mom always fought to make sure that like the women's entrance wasn't a separate door, like stuff like that. So like that was also part of her, like local activism in a way. She was like advocating for local women as well. So yeah, I mean, I didn't always like going to the mosque, of course. Actually, I said I didn't feel shame, and maybe I'm whitewashing my own history in a way. I didn't like going to Pakistan very much.
Oh, you didn't?
No, I didn't like going to Pakistan. But I think that's because like I had like attention problems.
Where are your parents from in Pakistan?
They're from Punjab. They're
Punjab.
from Pindi and Faisalabad.
Oh, Pindi and Faisalabad.
Yeah.
Okay. I was born in Pindi. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So why didn't you
You know
like...
where Benazir got killed?
No.
And Liaquat Bagh.
So it's interesting when I say
Our
I
house
was,
is across the
yeah.
street from
So
that,
when I
basically.
say I was born in Pindi and I was raised in Lahore, my husband always makes fun of me that your idea of Lahore's geography is very limited because I used to be driven around. So the idea of what Lahore really
Totally.
looks like, unfortunately, I wish I could. I would one day just want to go back and be a tourist in Pakistan.
That was a great thing I did in my 20s.
Oh, you did that?
When I went to India, right? Like I went to India for, study abroad, a language program rather. And then I went back to Pakistan for the first time by myself and went as a tourist. And like I had friends from college that I could go with. It was so good. It was like changed everything for me, I would say, in my relationship to my identity. Like that was a major moment of shift where like I could inhabit identity without my parents being a guide to it.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Do you like going back now?
Yeah, me and my wife go alone without our parents all the time. We are very comfortable going together. Like, obviously, we don't understand all the nuances. There's a lot of stuff like we can't go and like bargain at the market effectively. Like everyone knows that we're American, even if we can speak to them in our Urdu. And yeah, but we go pretty often. Still have a lot of connections. And that's not necessarily something that I thought would be true. I'd be like, after my parents die, like, am I ever gonna go back? But it's like, oh yeah, like now it's like very obvious that I'm gonna continue to have connections for the rest of my life and continue going there for the rest of my life. It's not gonna be an issue for like my kids. They'll still also go, and I'm a fine enough guide. Like I can get along like even in the streets with my Urdu, even if it's not native, it's enough. It'll work.
Are there moments when you feel more Pakistani than American and then vice versa?
Well, I just feel like, I mean, I agree that there's some things about America that are very, very distinct to America, but like there's also, like I think people often use America as a synonym for white, and I don't think that you know what I mean? Like, and that's like Black Americans are as American as white people, for instance, and so are Latinos and like Chinese immigrants. They've been here forever, So I struggle with I don't think in that binary that often, but then sometimes I get in situations where I'm like, oh yeah, this binary exists. Like for instance, when I'm in Pakistan, I'm very loud. I forget how loud I am. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm like an incredibly like blunt and loud American, and I know that I'm like that kind of in America too, but I'm less so. It's really noticeable when I go to Pakistan. I don't relate to American food culture very much, I don't know why, even though I didn't eat Pakistani food growing up, I just don't relate to the way like my white American peers, for instance, eat food. I don't know, I just don't get it. I don't know, the things that they like and the things that they're interested in.
In terms of food, I wanted to ask you something. So you wrote an article, Tikka Masala is a scam.
Yeah.
For BuzzFeed,
Yeah,
in
that was
which
a
you
fun one.
said, and I am going to quote this,
Oh
as
gosh.
a young Pakistani American, I often find myself battling misconceptions about my Muslim and Desi identities. Half the time, I'm explaining why I am not quite Indian, and the other half, I'm explaining why I am definitely not Middle Eastern or Arab. This,
Yeah.
Ahmed, is the very essence of how most Pakistanis feel.
Absolutely.
We are not Arabs, and it really annoys me when people conflate us with that.
Although there's some Arab supremacists in our society who are like, actually, we're originally Arab. Like we're not,
It's crazy,
we're not
right?
descended from.
And culturally,
Indians.
we are more like in tune with Indians, right? I understand their culture more
Absolutely.
because in terms of food, although as you pointed out, tikka masala with cream is not what we are used to. We have this middle child syndrome. Nobody is willing to
Absolutely.
accept Pakistanis as Pakistanis, and we are trying to carve out our own identity. And it gets frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, being in the media space, it's like when I read an article about Desi identity, it's almost always about Indians and it excludes other identities. And it's frustrating to me because like as a Pakistani, I'm always being like, what about Indians? What about Bangladeshis? What about, you know what I mean? So like I didn't think I would do this, but when like I write an article like that, I only interviewed like Pakistani restaurants. And honestly, that distinction doesn't make any sense.
And have you noticed that with Pakistani restaurants, it will say, if it's a Pakistani restaurant, it will say Pakistani / Indians / Bangladeshi.
There's even one on 29th Street that says African as well. They do serve a lot of like West Africans there, but it's clearly not African food.
But an Indian restaurant will never say Indian
Yeah,
slash Pakistani.
totally.
So we are like, I think we have some kind of identity crisis going on.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of challenges around having pride in in being Pakistani and pride in a nation state. I mean, what's nice about India is they can be like, oh, we're like an old civilization or whatever, but Pakistan doesn't know what kind of civilization it is, which is a bummer because there are things, there's a lot of things that, like even like our Sikh origins, like for instance,
Yeah.
that's such a thing, you know what I mean? That people, the tragic history of partition sort
Yeah,
of erased, you know what I mean?
that's true.
So yeah, I don't know. It's a weird identity to inhabit, but I also think like for me, it's like I don't know. It's like a lot of people suffered and died for it, so it's like I'm not gonna just pretend like it doesn't exist. Like it does exist. A lot of people want to be like, why don't we just go back to like what like be one country? It's like have you seen
Why?
what's happening in India with the BJP right
We
now?
are fine where we are.
Yeah, like I don't want to go to live in the BJP.
And
Like
I want to talk about your podcast
sure.
now. You've done episodes on jinns and prom and hip hop in Islam. So you tackle some really interesting topics.
Yeah.
What did you learn from your episode about jinns? And I know you're agnostic when it comes to believing
Yeah,
in
yeah.
jinns. So what was one revelation that did anything change your mind though?
I'll say the main thing that was really weird about that is that I get a lot of messages from people being like, "Oh, I saw a jinn once." They're not necessarily Muslim, by the way. I get these messages like, "Oh, I think my boyfriend was possessed by a jinn. Do you want me to tell you about it?" I'm like, "Please don't. I really don't need somebody." Like, it's like people. I will say that I don't necessarily. It's not that I don't believe in jinn. Let me put it this way. I believe this. I believe that what we see, our perception of like the physical world, there's like other layers to reality, which is true, objectively true, because like of like the nature of like atoms and quarks and gluons and all that stuff. But like it's also like true that I think there's other elements that things that are happening that are really weird that happen to us, and we want to talk about them. And jinn inhabit that world for us. Like that's the Muslim version of it. It's like it's something that is unexplainably like some unexplainable spiritual energy. It's a jinn. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's our like sort of like religiously kosher way of saying it. And people want to talk about it. People really, really, really want to talk about it. And that I'm shocked at how many people, are like still messaging me like years later, like, oh, I saw this article you wrote in 2016. I have more. Do you want more? Like, let me tell you about the time that like I encountered a possession. Yeah. So that's big. The other thing is that it's people really want to have sex with jinns. People really, really want to fuck the jinns. I don't know why that is. I don't know what it is about like being
That's
made
not
of smokeless
spiritual
fire.
part of it or anything, right? Is it like I'm just trying to think why.
Well, I mean, in the Islamic cosmology, it's like, what options do you have? It's like they're the only other beings with free will. It's like otherwise, it's like it's not exactly a healthy emotional relationship with any other beings that we have. So
That's
like,
true.
so jinn is the only other option. You can't mess with an angel.
Maybe you can do another episode about jinns and specifics of
We
what.
just released one.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Another one.
Yeah, but you might not have seen it because there's some glitches with iTunes, the way it's working that I'm trying to resolve. It was just released like a month ago, and there was a lot of conversation about people wanting to have sex with jinns. I talked to a scholar, Ali Alomi, about it. So he has been. If you really want to learn about jinn, he's the pro. He's Ali A. Alomi on Twitter, and he every Wednesday does a thread about jinn. He's a professor, so they're really good.
I have to look into this now. I'm so intrigued because I never paid attention to jinns. I there are jinns in Quran and all. There's a mention of jinns,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I was like, I always thought it was a myth.
Yeah.
Which is so crazy because it is in Quran and we're supposed to believe everything
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
in Quran.
Yeah.
But I always thought it was a myth. And now that you did an episode and I was reading, as I was doing research on you, I was reading about jinns as well. So now I'm probably
Wow,
going to
classic.
do more research. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Another episode you did was prom.
Yeah.
What was your prom like?
That feels like eons ago, that episode. My prom was, I had my SAT the day after, and so I arrived at like 7:30, and at 8:15, my mom was like, all right, you got to come home now. She let me think about what like, I really have to move back there because I haven't talked about it with anybody in a long time because she passed away when I was like 21, so like soon after that, I guess. But she would be the main person who would remember that story, I guess. I guess basically, maybe I dated in high school, and she was kind of she was not as strict as some parents in the sense that she was like, okay, if you're gonna date, you're just not old enough. Like you need to date a Muslim person basically, or need to like marry a Muslim person. So I was not. There was minimal options in that regard growing up. So I did date people, and she found out, and she was like, you need to break up with him. So I might have told them that I was not meeting the person that I was dating at that time at prom, and I got away with that. Like they didn't check in on that. They weren't like, is she there? You know what I mean? Like they actually were not very good at it. They were like you're in so much trouble, and then they did nothing to punish me, which is why I'm a journalist, because they understood like you should do this thing this way. They explained that very well, but they never did a very good job. Like
So, as a young Pakistani American, how do you see dichotomy or difference between how girls are treated and how boys are treated?
absolutely.
We don't let our girls date as much, or
Right.
we have these like restrictions on who they should date and when they should start dating.
Right.
But then with boys, it's much more relaxed. Did you experience that with your sisters and you? Like, was it same for your sisters when they were growing up?
So I think there was a double standard, but it was probably slightly less stark in our family, and partially had to do because my mom was like a feminist and I was younger also. Like the younger child always kind of gets away with
Yeah.
more. But there was definitely certainly a double standard, and I'm sure that my sisters keenly felt about the way that I was being treated versus them. But I was always made very aware of it. You know what I mean? And my mother also kind of understood it, but she did like put a lot of extra pressure on the girls and standards on the girls that were not so much on me. I definitely think it happens in my family as well, which is funny because it's like in my family, the women are the higher achieving people overall. It's like a family of mostly women doctors and some men doctors. And the women doctors are like very prominent, I guess, in a way, and strong personalities. But yeah, then there's like for instance, I think there's like, even though my mom had a love marriage, she like probably was still trying to arrange matches for my sisters because she was worried about what would happen, which is we always thought was so strange. Was like nobody came to your wedding because it was so controversial, basically. So not like nobody, but like it's a small. If you look at the photos, it's like basically my mom's siblings and her cousins, and like pretty much nobody else. It was a really small family affair, and then they went to America the next day. So it's like, why are you trying to do this for us? Like, I don't understand.
So why was it controversial? Your parents' wedding.
I mean, it was just an era in which love marriages were not as common, and people were still. I mean, obviously, it still was happening at that point, but. Well, on my dad's side, he was definitely the first person of his siblings to choose his partner. So that was the really controversial part. And therefore, because they didn't like it, the families did not, at that point, connect. So, like, there was no family approval in the sense that, like, one family was like, I don't want him to marry her. And my mom's family was like, well, we probably don't want her to marry him either, but now you don't want you don't think our daughter's good enough? Fuck you. That's what I kind of imagine it to be like, at least. And they're fine now. Like, they get along now. And my mom built the bridge very well and kind of changed my dad's family about, like, outside partners in a way. So, yeah, I mean, they met in college. Like, they have, like, what they did. Me and them, I did the same thing as them. I met my partner in college because that was, like, the model. It was, like, you find a partner or an equivalent person who could, stand up to whatever your vision of the world is, and you make that vision happen. And a lot of their friends did that too, actually. But I don't know. It was just very. It seemed like I look at the photos and I'm like, that seems intense. The only person who seems happy is my dad. My dad is like, yes. I'm like, your mom is not there, your siblings are not there, but you're just like so happy to get married to this woman. So I guess you guys must have been in love.
So talking about love, I want to get your take on a movie that I watched, The Big Sick. Have
Yeah.
you seen it?
I have, yeah.
Okay.
Surprisingly, never did a full episode on it.
Yeah, you should do an episode on
Yeah.
it. I have a lot of questions about that. But what did you think about that movie from Pakistani Americans' perspective?
So I think we do this thing where, like, the things that we want in our media, we want them to be more perfect and make us look more perfect than they are. And The Big Sick, a lot of people didn't like it because it has a white woman sort of love interest, and like the white family is centered over the brown family. And there's a big scene that I do think is really problematic where, like, she's like, why do you, she basically, like, they're like, getting into an argument about like why he is still entertaining the arranged marriages or whatever, and he burns a box full of brown women or something like that. Like he has a box full of their biodata and he burns it, and it's like people were like kind of like, what is our humanity worth so little? That's the messy reality we live in, actually. I hate to say. I know tons of people with white partners, and those are some of the, there's a lot of people with white partners in our community, and there's a lot of reasons why we do that. It has to do with white supremacy. It has to do with the fact that our men are very sexist and don't support women. And it really happened to him. So it's like,
That's the part where I couldn't even criticize the
yeah,
script. And I was like, but this happened to him. So I can't really say much. Although I would say he could have done a better job in,
absolutely.
the way it was depicted. Because to me, and I grew up in Pakistan, so it's irrelevant to me. But I heard a lot of Pakistani American women or girls who grew up here, they were
Yeah.
offended by it.
Right.
Because there was this just a caricature of what a Pakistani American woman looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like very conservative and traditional. And there's nothing wrong with all of that. But then
Right.
again, there's a spectrum. There's a wide spectrum in terms of how we approach our religion, in terms of how we look, what we wear. Putting us all together in this just one box and defining us as is unfair to me.
So I think he did a super imperfect job, but I think one thing that's really weird about it is that people like, I feel like it's like a very Twitter way of looking at things. Like, what about that one scene where like he burns the box, and it's like that's a really frustrating scene. Nobody ever talks about the scene where there's the girl who's like, she's not played by an Indian, but she's like she like just calls him out. She's like, "Are you just fucking around?" She's like a total, like, she's not like a stereotype in any way. She's just like American desi girl, and she's just like taking him around. It's like, what? Like, this is so awkward. Are you just fucking around? Like, are you just wasting our time? It's like a criticism of him. Like, he puts a character in there that criticizes him, and he looks bad. Like he looks like he is, he's a liar. He's manipulating all these women. Like, it's like it shows bad characteristics about him. So like, it wasn't super like perfectly done, but it's clear that he like thought about it a little bit, you know what I mean? Like, and so I don't know. I just like, I don't even like admit that I like enjoyed part of that movie because it's become toxic in our community to talk about like liking some of this stuff. But like, for instance, I was fucking dying at that part where he does that PowerPoint for, like, does a comedy show that's basically like a PowerPoint about like how Pakistan is so great. I was like, this is like exactly that middle child syndrome that you were talking about. Is like, look at how great, like, this thing that you don't know anything about.
Yeah, and you don't even know where it exists.
Oh my
you
God,
just
I was
know there's
dying.
like,
I think we also push very hard against that, like, that this is not what we are. Like, there's actually a lot of indie movies with this plot that nobody cares about, like, that I actually think are very good. Like, Asif Manvi has this movie called, is it Sakina's Restaurant, or is it, I don't know. It's Sakina's Restaurant is the name of the play, where it's like has a similar thing about like disconnect with your parents, and then like he like has like a white partner, but like it's like really, really good.
I don't think people mind that narrative of disconnect with parents or marrying white woman. I think what people don't like is the way the other side is either, I don't know, denigrated, or it's like if you have a disconnect with your parents, it's somehow celebrated. And I don't know how to describe it, but
Yeah,
it's
for
like,
sure.
this person has a disconnect with his or her religion or their culture. So that's a good thing. The person has evolved.
Right.
And I think that's where the narrative needs to change.
Agreed. I agree with that. There's too much of that. There's not enough, and all the work, like, anytime I sit down to write a fictional project, which I try sometimes and I fail, it's like it never has that context. And I do wish we had more other stuff, more things that are different. But the thing is, it's true. Like, you just said to me, like, I'm worried my kids are don't understand my culture. It's like you have a podcast called like Immigrant Leader now, right? Like,
it is Immigrant.
Not Alien Chronicles.
It has been rebranded.
Yes. So like, and you're somebody who obviously thinks about this, but it's like it's a concern. Like,
but that's true for every culture,
For
right?
sure.
That's true for Italians. That's true for Irish. That's true for like even if you like having that identity and trying to preserve it. Again, I think it's a trait that is part of what immigrant identity is. Like, we just don't want to let go of that piece of identity that
Absolutely.
we bring from wherever we come, right?
Right.
But at the same time, we don't want people to think that somehow we are backward or we are
Right.
outdated
But
or
what
we
if
are
they do think
crazy.
we're backwards, though? Who cares? I don't
No,
care if they
but
think I'm backwards. If I'm doing that intentionally, then it's a problem. There's actors in your community who are doing that intentionally.
right. So
That's a
that's what
problem.
I meant. Like, I don't want them to do it intentionally to gain following or whatever the case. I don't want, and there is a lot of messiness in our community. We are
Absolutely.
fucked up in a number of ways, which we should be talking about as well. There are these double standards between men and women, even now. How we treat different professions,
Yeah.
how we raise our kids.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I
That's
want
super interesting.
I want to be integrated in the society, but I don't want to change my identity or who I am or my whatever accent I have or whatever quirks or craziness I bring from Pakistani culture. And I think that's where the tension lies.
Yeah. And I think the tension is messy, and it's okay to be messy. Yeah, I'm sure like Big Sick is not going to age super well. But it was like an interesting missive into the world that like hadn't been seen before for me. And I was like, oh, there's some things in this that I relate to. There's a lot that I don't relate to.
Yeah.
But I don't have to like take it as like the story of our community, and I can criticize him for, burning the brown woman in a box. That was definitely, I don't know why that went. Even if that happened in real life, he should have probably not put that in there because it is dehumanizing. It is definitely a dehumanizing moment. But the other reason this is hot on my mind is because Hala is also an Apple original that's coming out that's about like a Pakistani Muslim girl who's like skateboards. She dates a white guy. Her parents are like having marital issues. And people were really, really mad at it because of the same thing that all the stories are like, oh, we're disconnected from our parents and we like, like, where's the story where like we date like a Muslim person or whatever. And it was I kind of was frustrated because I was like, it's a Muslim woman. It was a Muslim woman in Hall Big telling her own, telling a version of a story that's hers. And it's like, why do we got to pretend like we're perfect or like.
And I don't see like causation. Like, you can be disconnected and may not end up with a white person
Yeah.
still, or you may be very much connected to your community and end up with a white person. So
Yeah, yeah.
I don't see a challenge in that.
Right.
Like,
But the internet does for some reason. They like really, just drag anything with a white protagonist, a white love interest, which you can put a white interest in there, and the reason you do it is to show like that things are fucked up. You know what I mean? Like it's like, and I suspect Hala might do that, but we don't know that because we've only seen a trailer, and people are like canceling the movie off of a trailer. Which is frustrating to me because it's like, well, how many feature films by Muslim women are available on a streaming platform? At least watch the movie and critique it, and engage with it, and like, I don't know.
And assuming everything is perfect in our communities, that's wrong.
So wrong.
That's
it's
so
respectability
wrong.
politics is what it is.
Exactly. That's so wrong. We have to see our community for what it is. There are good things and there are really bad, messy things that we have to recognize.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't help us to say we're perfect at all, I don't think. And that's the space that I try to live in, is like that imperfect space. Because I know I'm very imperfect.
So before we wrap up, I want to ask you this last question, which I ask every guest. If you were to describe America in a word or a sentence, how would you do that?
Word or sentence? It's capitalist as hell is what it is. America's capitalist as hell, and it's deteriorating in front of our very eyes. That's how I feel.
That's a great description. Thank you, Ahmed. This was great. This was wonderful.
Yeah.
I had so much fun, and everybody should check out your podcast. See something, say something, and it's available on all major platforms, right?
That's right. You can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Ahmed Ali Akbar if you want to tip me for my work so that I can continue making it.
And we'll end on this note. Thank you.
Shameless self-promotion.
Thank you so much for listening. We are on Patreon. So if you want to contribute, also, if you like what you hear, just share our podcast on Apple Podcasts. It helps us grow our audience. And come back next week when we will have another amazing, amazing episode.